Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with part 12, guesses at what to expect from some mystical adventures by G.R.S. Mead. Chapter 12, Guesses at what to expect. One of the most pregnant of the great sayings that foreshadow the nature of the mystery of the divine is the utterance in paradox. He is greater than great and smaller than small. Divinity transcends all size and quantity, exhausts all numbers. The problem of medieval scholasticism, how many angels can stand on the point of a needle, has here no place, for the answer is none and all. Perhaps at no time in the history of the world have instructed minds been better prepared in the preliminaries for realizing the great truth hidden in the above paradox than they are today by the labors of science. The telescope has revealed to us immensities of space that stagger the imagination, and hugeness of bodies and of systems that bring man to his knees in wonder at the vastness of the universe and the gigantic atoms that circulate in the limitless ether. The mind is thus loosed from its bonds of size and calms itself in the sure conviction that there is an endless series of immensities, the very first terms of which exhaust the resources of even the most sensitive plate for stellar photography. On the other hand, the microscope has made visible the regions of the minute and brought into the field of man's physical sight myriads of the countless millions of small lives that people the tissues and fluids of our bodies, and has opened up new worlds where there was previously nothing visible. The searching analysis into what had been hitherto regarded as the final units of matter has forced from the intellect an almost unwilling confession that minuteness is endless, and that the mind, in following the logical sequence of its analytic nature, loses itself in the infinitude of smallness. Here, then, stands the mind of man between the twin immensities of greatness and smallness, amazed at the mechanical revelation of the hitherto physically invisible. But has he really plunged into the depths? Has he done anything else than bring new otherness to birth in that which was once the same for him, because it was the invisible? This continual forthgoing is in itself no deepening, but rather a more extended pouring of himself over the surface of things. There are as yet few signs that these new discoveries are being used for what they are manifestly purposed, namely, to teach man about himself and his relation to the divine. The grand intuition that every single thing in the universe is designed for no other purpose than to teach man concerning himself is the special persuasion of the mystic. This does not mean to say that man as he is the center of the universe, but it does mean that man contains potentially in himself the whole universe, and therefore he has a depth within that can partner the immensity without. And from this divine congress will be born the power of conscious self-revelation, which will end the mystery by becoming the mystery. It is a comforting reflection, not only that there is nothing common or unclean when embraced in the purity of the divine thought, but that the lessons we have to learn may be as easily read in the commonest objects as in the rarest phenomena. The one thing requisite is to have our attention aroused in such a way that we become absorbed in the interest of the study. Now, interest is that which concerns us, something that profits or advantages us, and the greatest interest is therefore that which profits or benefits or makes better the permanent element in us, or perhaps it were wiser to say that which enables the permanent element to come into clearer manifestation in us. Let us, for instance, consider an amoeba. The name comes from a Greek word signifying change and exchange, and has been chosen to designate a microscopic protozoon, that is, a primitive life, or the simplest living plasm, the most typical class of which exists in all freshwater ponds and ditches. It exists as a tiny mass of protoplasm and moves about and grasps particles of food by means of protrusions of its body, or self-made tentacles, which are called pseudopodia or false feet. And the food thus seized is engulfed in the body by any portion of its surface, there being no distinct mouth, and so absorbed. Because of its thus continually changing its shape, it has been called the Proteus animalcule. The myth of Proteus, who was fabled to be ever changing his shape, came originally from Egypt, as Homer has it in the Odyssey 4:384. Hither there comes and there goes old man of the sea, whose words are e'er true, Egypt's undying Proteus. What then can we deduce concerning ourselves from such an apparently insignificant creature? What lesson can we learn? The amoeba is possessed of life and instinct, but has no mind, as man has mind. We therefore cannot learn from it concerning mind as we understand mind in man, but man is not mind only, and therefore what it has to teach would seem to be an object lesson to arouse an intuition of, or an exercise in guessing at, the nature of the normally subconscious in man. Small as it is, it may be a living symbol of greatness, for the mind of man has the power of magnifying and decreasing size, of expanding the little into the great, and of enfolding the great into the little. What then if we were to compare this small life, this primitive creature, with the stage beyond mind as we generally know mind in man? The amoeba has as yet no mind developed, so also, it might be said, the spiritual consciousness has as yet for man no mind. For mind, as we know it, is the power of multiplicity and complexity of form. And in many ways, spiritual consciousness is a consciousness of the one and only one. But when we say the stage beyond mind, we should not think too definitely of degrees of dignity and allow ourselves to assume that in itself one is higher than the other. Both are admirable in themselves, both are working out their own mystery. Neither is afore or after the other. They are simply other. The consciousness which we have called spiritual might be termed unitary. It is the state of consciousness a man gets to when he leaves personal mind behind. And by this is not meant that mind is abandoned as a thing of little worth, but that for a time a man leaves it to experience a unitary otherness that is set over against the manifold othernesses inherent in mind, and so to realize what on his return, when interpreted in terms of mind, will be a sameness. The mode is that of an outbreathing and an inbreathing, or, if it be preferred, an inbreathing and an outbreathing. It depends on one's prejudices which order is preferred. The wise man has no preferences and can see either way. Now, many learners of these mysteries expect that the moment they get outside their own minds, that is, what they have hitherto regarded as their minds, they will immediately have some enormously extended consciousness of the same kind. That practically the man who can rise out of his own mind is immediately capable of knowing the ideas and mind workings of every other person. But when a man gets outside his mind, when he rises above the limits of dimension, he immediately loses every sort of consciousness connected with mind and object. The whole world of separation is gone. The whole world of moving objects is gone. The whole world of separated individuals struggling and fighting against each other is gone. And at first he gets to a state of consciousness in which, like the amoeba, he feels only himself and his own living processes. He is only conscious of himself and living processes which seem to be himself. He becomes the one and only one for him, a sort of cosmic amoeba or a beginning, or an essential unit of consciousness on the one and only side of things. He is no longer using mind or the power to ray forth. He is not seeing mind, so he ceases to see, know, or in any way be conscious of that scope of consciousness which normal men use. But he awakes to a new field of consciousness and becomes aware of those processes of life that are common. Common, not special, Catholic, not individual. He becomes aware of life pulsing in blood. He becomes aware of breath, which is a new activity of the true mind worlds unconnected with dimension. He thus becomes aware of many things that the modern mind can in no way understand, and so sets down to superstition. But it has well been said, superstition is outside reason, so is revelation. The first is below, the second is above, the first is a reflection of the second. Even so, the amoeba is really a reflection of the living one we're groping after, and not the living one, a figment of the imagination deduced from the Proteus animalcule, so that all these superstitions that have come down to us from days when blood and breath circulated in the plasm more strongly than mind played in it, may have new meaning for us when interpreted according to the gnosis of natural revelation. That lost art, which has been mechanically, and therefore superstitiously, in the sense of remaining over without explanation or understanding, handed on in the making of talismans and amulets, and in the use of symbols, may, by an understanding of the life in blood and breath, be someday rediscovered in higher modes. And we might even say that the man who possessed the consciousness we are in search of would become aware of all natural talismans and amulets and symbols, and of that side of the universe whereby objects which appear dead become alive and yield up their meaning, a meaning quite unconnected with normal persons or minds. The magical belief that if you have a man's name written in his own blood, then you hold that talisman by which alone a man can be held is of course a superstition. But in what else is the name of the man written but in his blood? The name in ancient Egyptian wisdom was the man's great person, his higher self or mind, and this is written in the life in his blood, the greater life impulses that lead him to action. For the writing of the name is the expression of himself in his character, that is, in characteristic acts. It is then of the utmost benefit to try to get a clearer idea as to what to expect. When we succeed in getting outside our normal personal limit or mind, we should not expect to know everyone else's mind. It's not a case of multiplying minds together when we get outside our own minds. We do not immediately arrive at the LCM, least of all at the GCM, of all minds, as many may suppose. We first have to lose ourselves before we can find ourselves, as a word of wisdom has it. If then we can compare the little with the great, with our amoeba before us, we may not be so far wrong in guessing that we first of all return to what may be symbolized as a sort of mucilaginous jellyfish kind of consciousness. Our attention is directed towards life pulses rather than impulses, so that if by chance we ever attain to the condition of that state of consciousness and still continue to expect mind visions, it will mean that we will get no consciousness at all, for there will be no mind visions. There are many doubtless capable of rising occasionally above the limitations of the normal mind, the limits of the person, but they are not aware that they do this because, expecting wrongly, they think they only attain to unconsciousness. We might perhaps here try to get some further ideas along the line of jellyfish. Nor should this be considered ridiculous. Once an aspirant asked a teacher on what he should concentrate, expecting doubtless to be given some lofty object or sublime concept, but the answer was the unexpected, the mark of wisdom: try a matchbox. Why then should we not meditate on a jellyfish? Why not indeed? For a jellyfish is a popular name of many kinds of what science calls acalyphs, such as sea blubbers, etc. And a jellyfish is a headless organism, and that is just what we want to do: get rid of our head and withdraw that pseudopod into the body of the plasm, that is the sphere. Jellyfish are called in the unlovely language of science discophorous hydrozoans, that is, creatures that live in the water and have a disc-like form. They are possessed of an umbrella-like disc, by the pulsation of which, that is, by its alternate dilation and contraction, they propel themselves through the water. They are like a free lung in their natural element. Why then may we not exercise our imagination in translating this living symbol into language that may be applied to man's spiritual plasm? At the beginning of the transformation, we should thus become human jellyfish, floating about in the great ocean of life, possibly an ocean of color and sound. The analogy, of course, should not be strained into an identity. For the floating is really not a moving about. There is no traveling on that path, as the mystical commentary called the Jnaneshvari on the Bhagavad Gita has it. Nor is the developed organism of a jellyfish so good an analogy as an amoeba, but it will serve as an exercise. Now, how does a jellyfish think? Because it will be with us, by analogy, a thinking somewhat of that kind, though in another order. We have to lose our mind to gain our mind. We have to lose momentarily our mind and begin all over again, developing mind in a new sea of substance, in the sea of the quintessence. Those who are interested in these things may read somewhat of them in A Mythiac Ritual, the 6th little volume of my Echoes from the Gnosis, which deals with the formation of this perfect body, the beginnings of which we are endeavoring to feel after. It is fundamentally a question of temperature and blood. Using these terms in an extended meaning, it is by means of mind that we first let the temperature down and create jellyfish or amoebae, that is to say, shapes rather than forms. For they are at first connected with expectations and do not descend into the formal mind. Nevertheless, it is the mind that is the great reducer of temperature, and here we may refer to the idea suggested in the adventure called adumbrations. Man in prenatal existence is built up all over again, right from the amoeba stage through all phases of evolution. And we may very well regard this marvelous fact of embryology as an adumbration of still greater things. It is indeed a case of the development of jelly and fish, ovum and spermatozoon, egg and serpent, the master symbols of little and great genesis and of apotheosis in the mystery traditions. What is set forth in the lower mysteries of generation as the means of formation of the human body may very well be believed to be a foreshadowing of the greater mysteries of regeneration and a typifying of the manner of the great work, so that we may guess with some assurance that what is expected of us is that in the next stage or regeneration we should attempt consciously to build out of the life fluid of the Divine Mother a form, a new mind, which will link us right back to the uttermost points in evolution. If we were to think more earnestly of these mysteries, on the symbolic lines that have been handed down to us from antiquity, we should see how absurd are the vague ideas on the next stage of consciousness that are generally floating about in the minds of people who have not heard of these traditions. The great thing is not to expect miracles, but natural processes. It is a most healthy exercise to be continually analyzing and revising our own expectations, trying to see clearly what we are expecting, remembering further that man is just what he expects. Expectation is really his field of consciousness. To expect means to look out. Expectation is thus the mold into which power is cast and which thus creates shapes. And shapes in this connection have to do with capacities. Anything cast into a mold turns out a shape. Form should mean something far more definite and organic than shape. But if it may be said that man is what he expects, this does not mean that if we expect to become the absolute or have cosmic consciousness immediately, that our expectations will be successful or fulfilled. By expect in this sense is meant see forth beyond the normal mind limit, and by see is not meant absurd wild imagination, but guessing the next step in proper orderly sequence. It is quite believable that he who could guess what would be the exact next step in his evolution could immediately take this step. This is the right use of imagination and reasonable anticipation. But to do this, there must be capacity for expecting in detail. Right expectation is thus the first step to becoming. Expectation is the mold which creates shapes, and shapes are the first foundations upon which power builds in the creation of form. Shapes are again, as it were, the skeletons, or rather scaffoldings of forms. There is a definite specific something in forms which there is not in shapes. It is then not such a wild guess, not so absurd an exercise in the practice of living symbolism to picture oneself as a jellyfish floating about in the ocean of the one element, the unitary or quintessential life substance. And then to add to this all the ideas we can get along the line of prenatal existence, imagining that we are being built up by this life and that we are thus fluid and independent, that we are blossoming forth from within the life fluid of a body of substance greater than ourselves. Neither an amoeba nor a child in prenatal existence knows of the struggle for existence as we do. They only know themselves and the processes with which they are surrounded. It would thus be a great help in this exercise to try to imagine the feelings of a babe before it is born, and how that it is not such a surprise to it as we might be inclined to believe to get born, because it has already felt the magnetic currents of the world by means of the life fluids of its mother, the world which it now, when born, sees by means of mind instead of only feeling. Before birth, babies are simple creatures, or creatures without mind, and their life feeling is thus, as it were, a more direct imprint of the cosmos than when they are dominated by a separative mind. There is no mind, it is said, till the first breath is drawn, and then it is embryonic only. It is thus quite credible that if a man could realize the consciousness of his sympathetic system, he would come into closer contact with the working of the cosmic laws than he does in his normal separative consciousness. And this indeed is said to be what happens when the neophyte is first instructed how to leave his mind or person behind, as a shell upon the seashore of manifestation, and retire into the depth of his sympathetic nervous system. But for such an one, the consciousness will not be just that of a lower animal. He's being trained deliberately to leave his mind behind, and does not do so by accident or owing to natural causes, as is the case with idiots. Though he loses the form of his mind, he does not entirely lose the power of his mind. He will no more be able to cast his awareness into mind consciousness, but he will be possessed of very great capacity of awareness. He will, we may well believe, when retiring back into blood and nerves, have all the alertness of a well-developed mind, all the power and capacity for observation, but he will not be able to cast his experience into any mental forms, because they are experiences of the other side of the world and not the formal mind side. Such are a few guesses at what we may expect or imaginings of what we may look out for if we consciously attempt to regenerate ourselves. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.